Hello and welcome to How to Film Weddings. My name is Nick Miller and today we are starting a brand new series on videos for people that are just getting started in the wedding filmmaking industry. In our Facebook group, we are seeing so many people mention how this is their first wedding. They're so excited. What do I need to do? What do I need to learn? All of these kind of things. And so John and I wanted to break down some basics for people that are just getting into the wedding filmmaking industry. So I'm going to share with you a few videos about some basics that you should really know and things that you should understand as you enter into the wedding video world. We're going to talk about camera basics and audio equipment and how to set your camera and all that stuff in this series. And today we are starting all of it off by talking about the exposure triangle. Ooh. You know, I said that and in my head I was thinking Bermuda Triangle because I thought it would be kind of scary or something, but never mind. Let's get started. So as I mentioned in today's video, we are going to talk about something that I call the exposure triangle. And what I mean by that is there are three parts to exposure that you really need to know and understand, and all of them work together to properly expose the image within your camera. The three parts are the f-stop or aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, and those three form a triangle. See how I did that there? So the first thing that I want to talk about is the f-stop, which is also known as the aperture. The f-stop controls how much light is let into your camera. Think of the f-stop as the pupil part of your eye. Whenever you close your eyes really tight and then open them up really big, that pupil, that middle part, gets really, really big to allow light in and then closes down to adjust for the exposure of all of the light. That is what your f-stop is doing. The more open that your f-stop is, the wider the hole is going to be, which is going to let in more light. Wider f-stop or wider aperture means a lower number. So something really low like 1.2, 1.4, 1.8, something like that tells how big it is. And so it's going to let in more light. If it is a higher number like f14, f22, even higher, that is going to let less light into your camera. Not only does f-stop affect how much light is coming into the camera, it also affects something called depth of field. Have you ever been watching another person's video, a movie, something, and like the person is in focus but everything else is out of focus? That is called depth of field. Here in this little graph, you can see that at f1.2, the subject is in focus and the background is very blurry. Whereas that number gets higher and higher, say f14 or f22, the entire background and the foreground, everything is in focus. So as you pick up your camera and you're messing with your settings and you want that nice creamy background, that nice blurry background, and you're not sure how you obtain that, you need to have as low of an f-stop or as an aperture as possible. So the two main points that you need to walk away with understanding this part of the exposure triangle is that f-stop manipulates the light that is allowed in as well as depth of field. Are you finding this information helpful? Make sure you give us a big thumbs up to let us know. So the second part of the exposure triangle is shutter speed. While f-stop talks about how much light can come into your camera, shutter speed determines how long light is allowed into your camera. Think of this in terms of blinking your eye. If you only blink once per minute, you are going to let a lot more light into your eye so you can see more. If you're blinking a lot, like this, you see a lot of black and everything's a lot darker. So when it comes to shutter speed, the lower the number, the more light is let in over time, and the higher the number, the less light is let in over time. There are a couple things that you need to be mindful of when it comes to shutter speed. The first is what you should set that number at. Your shutter speed should always be at least double your frame rate. So if you are filming something in 24 frames per second, the lowest that your shutter speed should go should be 1/48th. If you're shooting in 30, 1/60th. If you're shooting in 60, 1/20th, so on and so forth. One of the big things that shutter speed affects is motion blur. Here's a quick example of me. See my hand here, how I'm waving it, and how there's a lot of blur in that. Okay, whenever you have double the frame rate for your shutter speed, you're gonna be a lot more blurry like this. There's a lot more motion blur. If you take a look at this little graph here that I have, Okay, the lower the shutter speed number, the more motion blur. And as that number gets higher and higher and higher, the crisper the image is going to look. The third part of the exposure triangle is what is called ISO. While the f-stop determines how much light has come in and shutter speed determines the length that light is let in, ISO allows to brighten or darken your image inside of your camera. If you want a real world example of what I'm talking about when I say brightening or darkening your image, have you ever been out at night and taken a picture on your cell phone and the image looks really, really grainy? That's because the ISO function of the camera on your phone is trying to brighten up the image because it is so dark outside. So with ISO, you can brighten an image or darken an image depending on the lighting situation. The downside of ISO is that the higher the number, the more grain or artifacts are going to be introduced into your image. There are lots of different determining factors on ISO and what number you should use, and all different cameras actually have something that's called a native ISO, which this is the ISO that the camera was built to have the best picture with. So the main thing that you need to know when it comes to ISO is that the higher the number, you will potentially see more artifacts, you will potentially see more noise in your image and not make it as sharp and crystal clear as possible. Here's a quick picture example where you can see that the lower the ISO, the less digital noise there is in your camera. So those are the basics of the exposure triangle. You have f-stop, shutter speed, ISO, and they all work together. I remember when I started filming manually on a camera, it was very daunting to figure out all of this stuff. How does f-stop and shutter speed and ISO all work with each other, and how does changing one mess with the other? So what I wanted to do real quick was jump in and give you 3 helpful tips for manually setting your camera. The first one is this: when you manipulate one of these properties, you are going to have to adjust accordingly the other one. So if you lower your f-stop, you probably are going to have to higher your shutter speed. So let's say that your f-stop is currently at 2.8 and you take it down to 2.0, you might have to take your shutter speed from 1/48th to 1/60th or 1/80th, something like that, so that your image can be properly exposed. Just keep that in mind. Whenever you mess with one property, you are going to have to adjust the others accordingly. Number 2, make one of these properties your priority. So for whenever we film, we say that we want our shutter speed to be at 1/120th because we're shooting a lot at 60 frames per second. So we are doubling our frame rate, 60 frames per second, into 1/120th. That is as low as we want to go, and we want to keep that shutter speed the exact same. So we are going to leave the shutter speed and then manipulate either the f-stop or the ISO to get our proper image. The other thing that you can do is find your camera's native ISO and then try and keep it at that the whole day. Okay, depending on your camera, this can be really high or it can be pretty low depending on the sensor size of your camera or some other determining factors. So I have found that keeping your ISO at the native number is a little bit more difficult on a wedding day. But if you have a rule and you keep one of them the priority, then that is going to make the others a little bit more manageable, especially as you get going and you're learning how to set your camera manually. The third thing that I would suggest is to have a rule for how low you want your f-stop to go. Whenever we are shooting for Wild Oak Films, we typically do not go below 2.0 aperture or f-stop. Okay, whenever you go below that number, it can get really, really shallow. And if we're using our 50, which can go all the way down to 1.2, I can literally have the person's nose be in focus and their eyes be out of focus. Especially when it comes to video, a shallow depth of field can be real jarring and make it so that we don't know where we are supposed to focus. So for us, our rule is our f-stop needs to be at 2.0 or higher. This is a personal preference, and you need to decide how you want to run your business and what you want to do for the best quality films. I really hope that this information has been helpful for you for learning how to manually set your camera. The exposure triangle, f-stop, shutter speed, ISO, all of them work together. Remember, the f-stop determines how much light is let into the camera, shutter speed determines the amount of time that light is let into your camera, and ISO brightens or darkens your image whenever you mess with that one. So again, the higher the ISO, the more digital artifacts, grain, noise is going to be introduced into your camera. Be sure to check out this playlist right over here with other tips for beginning filmmakers and setting your camera and audio gear and all that kind of stuff. And also we have a course, the Complete Wedding Video Course. Click on this link right there and you can sign up to be put on the wait list, and you can join us the next time we open the course. Thank you so much for hanging out with me, talking about the exposure triangle, and until next time, we will see ya.